Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Steve Yuzpe, and I'm the CFO of Sprott Resource Corp and the chairman of one of our agricultural subsidiaries, One Earth Farms. I hope to convince you this afternoon that there are compelling reasons for your financial well-being to invest in agriculture. Throughout the presentation this afternoon, I'm going to interlace a few questions, and we'll start with one now. I'd like everyone to raise their hand if your preference is to eat every day. If you eat every day, all right. If you think that the emerging middle class in Asia and the developing nations also eat every day, raise your hand. All right. If the price were to rise 100%, would everyone continue to eat? 200%. Well, I think you get the point there that during times of economic contraction and uncertainty, the demand for food historically has declined less than the demand for other goods and services. So that gives us some built-in downside protection on investing in agriculture. On the plus side as well, agriculture has had strong risk-adjusted returns. And my personal opinion is that these strong risk-adjusted returns will continue along with certain other commodities into the future. I should point out, though, that there are some conflicting opinions on some of the data that I will present, and some people don't believe the trends the way I believe them to be. But it's my opinion that even if the future trends, even if the future turns out to be better than what these trends indicate, there will still be a very significant supply-demand impact on future food scarcity and food inflation. I should also point out, too, that these are very long-term trends, and this is not something you should base a short-term strategy on. Forward-looking statements for the lawyers in the audience. Before I jump into the actual presentation, I thought I'd give you a little bit of an explanation as to why I'm here. Sprott Resource Corp is a publicly listed private equity vehicle with expertise in the natural resource sector and investing in the natural resource sector. We have four core beliefs. We believe that massive government deficits are unsustainable. We believe that the fiat currency system is in peril. We believe that peak oil is real and here, and that food security and food inflation are now a permanent part of our lives. So with those as core beliefs, you can imagine that we've come to the conclusion that we want to own assets that the government can't print. And that's led us to investments in agriculture, energy, and precious metals. In fact, to put our proverbial money where our mouths is, to date, we've invested about $120 million into the agriculture sector. I think that most of the bullet points in this slide are fairly self-explanatory. I mean, who doesn't want strong returns that are uncorrelated to other assets? We all want inflation protection. As well as we discussed, food has a lower elasticity of demand relative to other goods and services, but that is true in all times, even times of chaos. And whether that's war, recession, depression, inflation, deflation, it doesn't matter. Food has had a lower elasticity of demand. In addition to what we just saw on the prior slide, I think there's the calming effect that we all feel in that humans are creative, ingenious, inventive, and we just have a knack of fixing things or finding a solution. So now with that, that's the summary of all of the good news that I'm going to present today. And with the rest of the presentation, we'll talk about the challenges that we're facing ahead of us. Opportunities will exist in investing in agriculture because there are significant near-term and long-term issues. The hurdles are too many and too great to actually overcome. And so we may find solutions to some of these issues over the long term. I believe that in the best case scenario, there will be localized food shortages and globally higher prices at best. But at worst, we may see dire consequences of things like civil upheaval or mass immigration. And when you combine food security and food inflation, and they're really quite linked, the results can be game-changing. We've seen regimes overthrown over the last several years. We've seen riots from Morocco all the way to Bahrain, and we've seen skyrocketing food prices in places like China and India. There are other issues that make investing in agriculture more difficult, though. We have these cyclical influences that create variation around the long-term secular upward trends in food prices. We also have a very small asset class. There are far fewer investment opportunities in agriculture for the public markets than there are in other sectors. I find this slide fascinating. This is the FAO's index of food prices. And if you look back to 2007, food prices have gone up dramatically, they've stayed high, and volatility has remained high. And it's my opinion that this is the future of food prices globally, high and with high volatility. You literally can't go a day now without reading about either food scarcity or food inflation in the mainstream media. And we randomly selected some headlines over the last 6 months, and the themes are fairly consistent. Whether it's food inflation-induced poverty, food inflation-induced political uprising, water scarcity, depletion, pollution, skyrocketing prices, etc. We see the same things over and over in the mainstream media. In a moment, I'm going to get to the long-term secular trends that underpin our agriculture thesis. But before I get there, I want to talk about 3 agroeconomic factors that are all somewhat interrelated. So the first one that I want to talk about is currency. So as countries like the US, the EU, the UK, Japan, and so on debase their currency, 2 things happen. One, it pushes up the nominal cost of everything, all of the resources that are used to produce and distribute food: oil, fertilizer, steel, etc. As the price of those resources goes up, the price to produce food goes up, and the meal on your table is more expensive. Secondly, as US and other nations debase their currency, they are in general exporting inflation, but very specifically they're exporting food inflation. And there are 2.6 billion people today that live on $2 a day or less. Imagine the impact of food inflation on these people. There are already 40% of Indian children under the age of 3 that are considered malnourished. In North America, we complain about higher prices, and we spend less than 15% of our disposable income on food. So you can imagine that as their food becomes more expensive, it is far more painful than what we experience here. The second point is geopolitical crisis and food as a political tool. And whether we look at the riots in 2008 or 2011 or 2012, and all of these have been linked back to skyrocketing food prices, governments will take strong action to ensure that their populations are well fed. I think it's well understood that when populations are hungry, there's political upheaval and there's revolution. And if I believe one thing about governments, it's in their belief of self-preservation. The third point is weather. And I used to think of weather only as a cyclical factor, but I've actually changed my mind on that, and I've got a number of slides on weather, and I believe that it is absolutely a secular trend as well as a cyclical factor. Weather has caused havoc with farming since the beginning of time, but it seems to be getting worse. 2012 saw devastating droughts in the US, Russia, and India. 2010 and 11, we had droughts in Russia and the Ukraine. We had floods in Canada and Pakistan. And in Australia, we had both, believe it or not, droughts and floods. And so if we tie weather back to food as a political tool, in 2010, as Russia was experiencing these severe droughts, they actually restricted all wheat exports to ensure that their local population had enough to eat. In 2012 and 2013, we've seen Argentina do the same thing. Not complete restrictions, but they put export restrictions on to ensure that local populations had an ample supply of cheap food. I believe that weather will continue to increase both in its volatility and the ferocity of the weather that we've seen. I could have also talked about inventories, political risk, and trade policy, but the truth is inventories go up and down, and there's nothing that I can say about governments that I'm sure most people in this room don't already think. So now over the next 15 or so pages, I'll take you through the supply-demand fundamentals. Some of these issues are very well known, and other issues are emerging that I think will be in the mainstream press more and more frequently in the future. Farmland per capita is running short. Good quality farmland close to our cities is even more scarce. The FAO, which is a UN organization, believes that by 2030, we can add an incremental 120 million hectares of land to our production base. That's an increase of about 9%. That's good news. The problem is, in the same time frame, our population globally will grow by 21%. So again, this math is working against us, and notwithstanding any of the other factors that I'm going to talk about later, the farmland per capita will continue to decline. The global population is growing by about 80 million people per year, and I'll come back to this point when I talk about the demand drivers. So on top of the fact that we're losing good quality farmland, it's either being degraded completely or it's being lost through things like urbanization, pollution, and water scarcity. We are losing our farmland. And as I just talked about the math of population growth and farmland growth, we have a numerator that's shrinking and a denominator that's growing. There is some good news in that we're not farming all of the world's available farmland. Places like Brazil, Russia, and the Ukraine have quite a bit of potential farmland. Even in the US, there's a program called the Conservation Reserve Program, where there's approximately 30 million acres that could be brought into production under the right set of circumstances. The bad news is that most of this land is either very marginal land or very far away. Both of those things will increase our cost of production and the cost to get the food on our tables. One factor as well to consider that when you're converting land from one type to another, it takes about 5 years to move to fully fertile soil. So let's talk about Brazil for a moment, as you can see on the slide. They have, by a wide margin, more available farmland than any other country. In fact, more than the next two countries combined. The area being converted from savanna or a grassland into cropland is called the Cerrado. But it takes years to convert the soil. It takes high doses of phosphorus, lime, pesticides, chemicals, and fertilizers, and it has very expensive infrastructure, or it will require very expensive infrastructure investment to bring the crops and the beef to ports. So turning this land from grassland into farmland may help with food scarcity. It will absolutely exacerbate food inflation problems in the future. That said, it's better to have high-priced food than no food at all. All else being equal, we need approximately 1.75% yield growth per annum to keep up with the global population growth. Historically, we were able to rely on improvements in seed technology through selective breeding, seed technology through biotechnology, farm equipment technology, and soil agronomics to outpace our population growth. In fact, if you go back to the 1960s, yield growth was approximately 3% per annum. In 2004, these lines crossed to the downside, and the current trend is approximately 1.4% per annum. So the population growth has now outstripped the natural yield growth in yield. As well, all of these varieties have theoretical limits to how much the yield can increase. And so there will be a point when we reach these theoretical limits and we will no longer be able to derive anything out of our seeds. Now, the decline in yield growth can be offset. There are two factors staring at us straight in the face that can lead to improvements. One is through biotechnology. But I think we've seen that there is significant global opposition to biotechnology. In fact, there were just protests yesterday against Monsanto and GMO technology here in Vancouver. So biotechnology may not be a solution if there is too much global opposition. The other potential opportunity we have is to take the successes we've had in the developed world and move it into the developing world. This will take significant time and capital, but it actually should provide future benefit. Now, I should point out, though, that a lot of these underperforming regions around the world have been underperforming for basically ever. And if it were easy to correct, they would have already been corrected. So while there is opportunity there, it will not be easy or cheap. Weather patterns are changing. Absolutely. And whether you believe that the change in weather is man-made or whether you believe that it's this long-term natural cycle, I won't enter into that debate today, and I'll leave that each to have your own opinion. But weather is becoming more volatile and the Earth is becoming hotter. This is going to have an enormous impact on the supply of food. I think this picture, to the point that I just made, says it all. This is the change in temperature globally over 4 decades. You can just see it getting redder and hotter. 2012 in the U.S. was the hottest year ever in the continental U.S. Temperatures were 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the 20th century average, and 1 degree Fahrenheit higher than the previous record year, which was 1998. 1 to 3 degrees may not sound like a lot. In fact, it doesn't seem like a lot at all, but when it comes to agriculture, that is a big impact. Grains simply do not like high temperatures, and the strains were developed over thousands of years in moderate, stable climates. So as our world is becoming hotter, the grains cannot adapt very quickly to that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a U.S. panel, believes that if temperatures rise to the temperatures that they expect, global ag production will decline by 20 to 40%. Those are absolutely unfathomable numbers, 20 to 40%. I hope they're wrong. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor from 2012. So you can see the impact of, now we all read about the drought over the last year in the U.S., but again, I think this picture says it all about what they experienced. And you saw the decline in their agricultural production and what that did to food prices last year. Canada is being impacted as well, but differently. And if the IPCC is correct, ironically, northern climates like Canada will actually be great benefactors of climate change. Now that said, the net benefit globally will be negative. While Canada might be a winner, globally we will see declined production. The rain patterns in India could have a massive impact on that country and 1 billion people, to use another example now. The annual monsoons in India have historically delivered very stable and predictable amounts of rain, but that is changing. In fact, last year alone, India received 19% less rain than normal. These rains are absolutely the integral water source to Indian agricultural production. If the experts are right and this water and climate change issues persist, India's agricultural production could increase by up to 30%. They will move from being a modest net exporter of agricultural commodities to a very large net importer. Again, China is not immune to these issues. They will have, in the same time frame, if the IPCC is correct, Chinese agricultural capacity could decline by 15%. It makes us think that we're pretty lucky here in Canada. I'm going to read a quote from The Economist, because I think I'm now going to start talking about water. And I think The Economist summed it up nicely back in 2010. The world's most expensive commodities are nothing in the absence of water. Fresh water is essential for life with no substitutes. Although mostly unpriced, it is the most valuable stuff in the world. There's 2 key points in that. There are no substitutes for water, and it is the most valuable stuff in the world, and yet it is priced essentially free to all of us in North America. Water is probably the least discussed scarcity issue of any resource I know of, but I believe that it'll move to the forefront in the next 5 years. The key point with water is that when we deplete these ancient, non-refreshing aquifers, they're out. They're literally finished. I mean, I guess technically that's not true. They refresh in about 1,400 years on average, but that's a little outside of our investment time frame, so we'll assume that they're out. There are ways to improve the amount of water that's recoverable through drilling and extraction technologies, but all that does is push the problem out. Something I learned a few years ago from my colleague and friend Rick Rule is that when you misprice a resource, you naturally get inefficient allocation of that resource. And let's assume that free is a mispriced resource. 70% of water today is used in 70% of water use today is from agriculture. The UN believes that over the next 5 years, the water demands from agriculture need to go up by 50%. Remember, we're starting with the 70% number. Water demands need to go up by 50%, and by 2050, the use of water in agriculture needs to go up by 100%. I don't actually think that we're going to run out of water globally, but I think that the future holds severe local shortages in areas that are water dependent, and I believe that it's inevitable that water becomes market priced. 56% of the world lives in water-vulnerable regions. Our freshwater levels per capita are in decline. High overuse tends to come from things like rapid urbanization and industrial development, like in the developing world, and it tends to come from things like heavy use of irrigation, which comes from the developed world. So again, we're in a bit of a quandary here. It's both the developing world and the developed world that are overusing water resources. Again, if you think about life here in Canada, we are lucky. We have ample water in Canada. So does America. In fact, the U.S. has 45% more water than average. But the problem with averages is that they hide the disparities or the real issues. The American West, or the Great Plains, which is an area of significant crop production, is actually considered overexploited by the UN's Water Scarcity Index. In fact, according to one source, America needs to spend $255 billion in the next 5 years to safeguard its water supply. Now that, in the era of trillion-dollar deficits, that may not seem like a big number, but it's still another $255 billion that you don't hear people talking about today. I've talked about this slide before, but I think this one's really important because it highlights, A, the issues around averaging and also issues facing the United States. The Ogallala Aquifer is a fossil aquifer that stretches about 200,000 square miles. It touches 8 states in the American Midwest. The volume of water in the Ogallala is about the size of Lake Huron. So the Ogallala, as a vital water source, is critical to the states that overlie it. 27% of all irrigated land in the U.S. sits above its boundaries, and this area is directly responsible for 20% of U.S. corn, wheat, soy, and cattle production. The Ogallala also supplies 80% of the drinking water to the people that live above its boundary. And I'm going to read you another quote here. This is from one person in the Ogallala, the USDA's Ogallala Research Service. So think about that for a second, that the USDA actually has a research service that's attached to this body of water. All we can do now, quote, all we can do now is try to engineer a soft landing. The Ogallala supply will run out and farming may not be possible in that region. That is, whether that's in 15 years or 30 years, that is absolutely a critical issue. The problem is conservation for the Ogallala is compounded by the fact that this body of water touches 8 states, which means 8 state governments, countless municipal water districts that are all fighting for a declining resource that's based on or governed by outdated laws. I don't see how they'll ever be able to coordinate a conservation effort. The other issue facing the Ogallala now is it's no longer just agriculture that's drawing on its precious water. Industries like oil and gas, which use the fracking process, are extremely water intensive. And as they begin to draw water out of the Ogallala for fracking, it just puts further stress on the resource. The average age of farmers is getting older every year, and the more rural you are, the higher the age. In Canada, if you move an hour outside of urban centres, the average age is 10 years higher than average. In the U.S., according to legendary investor Jim Rogers, the average age of farmers is 58. In Japan, it's 66. Their kids are simply not farming. They're moving to the cities. Now, the availability of trained farmers, especially in developed markets, needs to be addressed. And I think that's got to be a government policy response. All the ag technology in the world is absolutely useless without experienced, trained farmers. I mean, honestly, I say this a bit jokingly, but I don't know how long the current generation of farmers plans on farming, but it better be into their 90s, because we need time to develop solutions. I'm going to ask another question here. Is there anyone here that believes the future holds lower energy costs? Lower costs. Anyone that believes in higher energy costs? Right, so a sizable percentage of the room believes in higher energy costs. Well, energy and food prices are 87% correlated. You need energy to manufacture inputs like fertilizers, chemicals, steel, transportation at multiple points, processing, cleaning, retail, etc. I mean, the list goes on. But if you believe in higher energy prices, you absolutely believe in food inflation. We'll spend a few minutes now and we'll talk about the demand drivers, and then I'll wrap it up. So to reiterate what I said earlier, population growth is the most basic demand driver of grains, oil seeds, and animal proteins. The global population is growing by 80 million people per year. That's effectively a new Germany every year to put onto the world to feed. And that doesn't even consider the fact that there have been rumblings, albeit they still feel a ways out, that China may one day change the one-child per family policy. All of this is based on the status quo. The 60 to 70% of growth will come from developing countries like China, India, and Brazil. And these are also the countries that are growing wealth and changing their dietary habits. By 2050, the world will be 40 to 50%. There will be 40 to 50% more people. Over 9 billion people will inhabit the Earth. So to give you perspective on the number of people that is relative today, that's more than 2,000 million more mouths to feed relative to today. Globally, because the number of people plus the demands from other sources like changing diets, we don't need 40 to 50% more grains or oil seeds. We need to produce 80 to 100% more food in 40 years or 35 years than we produce today. 80 to 100% more. We can't, just keeping up with global growth will not be enough. The majority of the world's population and wealth growth is coming from the developed world. And there is absolutely clear evidence that as people's incomes grow, their consumption of animal proteins at the expense of vegetable proteins increases. We are seeing this happen again in Asia. People typically do not want to go back to consuming fewer calories or lower value calories once they've achieved a higher level of diet. This is a problem because it takes considerably more grain to produce a kilogram, considerably more grain to produce an equivalent amount of animal protein or just protein in general. An example would be in beef. It takes anywhere from 7 to 13 kilograms of grain to add 1 kilogram to a cow. Now the math is not as bad for poultry, pork, fish, etc., but is still a conversion ratio that is less than 1 to 1. This simply just adds more strain to the system. Biofuels are absolutely part of the problem, and I know that this is a spirited debate, more so south of the border, but there are so many things wrapped up into this debate. There are politics, there's energy politics, there's rural politics. The U.S. is not alone, though. By 2030, there are 41 countries that will have biofuel or ethanol mandates. That is not all, because some of the biofuel mandates are not based on food crops, but many of them or most of them are. The U.S. is targeting 30% by 2030, the EU 10%, and China 5%. But you know, it's worth making the point that not all biofuels are created equally. In Brazil, they make their ethanol out of sugar. You get 8 units of energy for every 1 unit put in with ethanol-based or sugar-based ethanol. In the U.S., they use corn, where you get 1.5 units of energy for every 1 unit input, and you're driving up the food staple at the price of a food staple at the same time. So now I recognize that there's an offset, and that from the ethanol process, the corn mash can be used in animal feed. However, I personally have never seen reliable data on the economic value of that mash going into the feed system. I know it exists, though. I just haven't been able to quantify it. Ethanol currently accounts for 8% of U.S. vehicle fuel. It requires the U.S. to divert 35 to 40% of the annual corn crop into ethanol production. That is corn that is taken out of human and animal consumption. Not only that, but there have been legislative changes enacted that have raised the blending limit from 10% to 15%. If that actually happens, that's 50% growth. If that actually comes through to fruition, up to 60% of the corn crop could potentially end up in a gas tank. There is one other little discussed fact when it comes to ethanol, and that's that it's very water intensive. All in, it takes anywhere from 1,700 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of ethanol. Now, that's an all-in number, but think of that. We are already facing water scarcity issues. Water is a problem. That brings me to the end of the speech. I hope that I've pointed out that the issues that we're facing today are not simply one demand driver, or we don't have simply one supply constraint. There are a multitude of issues. But that said, I believe we're still relatively early in the investment cycle, and that by taking a long-term view and investing in agriculture, you have a means to protect yourself. Thanks very much.